I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, after a weekend that saw the biggest missile and drone attack on Ukraine in almost a year, we examine whether President Biden's permission, finally, for Ukraine to use US weapons inside Russia is responsible statecraft or too little, too late.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Keep stand strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 18th of November, 2 years and 274 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes and Europe editor James Crisp. I started with the big news from the weekend. Now, I will come to the front lines shortly, but as a quick heads up, the big news over the weekend is this apparent shift in Joe Biden's position on policy permissions about weapons fired into Russia. This comes after the New York Times and the Washington Post reported that the US president has authorized Ukrainian forces to use US-provided ATACMS missile, the Army Tactical Missile System. ATACMS missile, range of about, just short of 200 miles, in limited strikes against Russian and North Korean military targets within Kursk Oblast. So quite a bit to unpack there, but which we will come to. President Zelensky said yesterday, "Today, many in the media are talking about the fact that we have received permission to take appropriate actions, but blows are not inflicted with words. Such things are not announced. The rockets will speak for themselves." What he's referring to there is that this is, as I say, comments from New York Times and Washington Post citing US officials, but no actual official word yet from the White House. Now, those US officials cited by the organizations said that the US authorized these limited strikes in response to the deployment of North Korean forces to the battlefield in Kursk Oblast to deter North Korea from deploying more forces to Russia. Now, the US officials said the partial lifting of restrictions aims to generate, quote, a specific and limited battlefield effect and will not change the course of the war. This was followed up by the French outlet Le Figaro yesterday saying France and the UK have authorized Ukraine to use the Anglo-French Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles, cruise missiles, to strike inside Russia. Le Figaro didn't say if the British and French had given permissions for Storm Shadow and Scalp to be used wider than Kursk. Now, this received the oft-rehearsed performative outrage from Moscow, as you'd expect, replete with all the usual chest-beating and the warm embrace of victim status, that latter being the Kremlin's safe space and go-to position in any crisis, as we know. Yeah, I'm just amazed. North Korean troops fighting in Europe, not an escalation. Iranian ballistic missiles fired into Europe, not an escalation. Chinese dual-use technology exploding in Europe, not an escalation. But Ukraine using missiles inside Russia apparently is a disaster. Now, we're going to go to Joe Barnes and James Crisp for comment on that later, but let's just touch on the weekend because it was also quite big on the ground in terms of activity. There was the massive airstrikes over the weekend is what I'm saying. Not much movement on the ground. But let's go back. Friday, Saturday night, big drone attacks continuing the pattern of late. Ukraine says it successfully shot down all 83 drones fired by Russia overnight Friday, Saturday. They say 53 were brought down through munitions and 30 by electronic warfare. However, the Kharkiv region was hit with an S-300 missile. Also on Friday during the day, I mention this now, it will come up later, Olaf Schultz, Chancellor of Germany, spoke to Vladimir Putin by phone, had an hour-long phone call, their first direct communication in almost 2 years. Schultz spoke later to reporters and said it was important to tell him, Putin, that he cannot count on support from Germany, Europe and many others in the world watching. The conversation was very detailed, but contributed to a recognition that little has changed in the Russian president's views of the war, and that's not good news. Okay, we will discuss this later. Is it good news at all that Schultz broke with convention? And he's the leader of his country, do what he likes, but I think the narrative around it and the framing of that call was fairly poor. It obviously didn't have any effect because overnight Saturday, Sunday, there was a massive missile and drone wave of attacks across Ukraine, the biggest missile and drone attack on Ukraine in almost a year. Now, the main target of this attack Saturday, Sunday was Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The Ukrainian Air Force said Russia had launched 90 Shahed and other type drones. We thought those other drones might have been decoy drones, as in to try and take the air defence missiles and attention elsewhere so that the actual attack drones can get through. But 90 drones and 120 missiles, including one Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, 8 Kinzhal ballistic missiles, 101 KH-101 and Caliber cruise missiles, an Iskander-M, and 4 KH-22 or 31 variant cruise missiles, and 5 KH-59-69. So a massive wave of strikes. President Zelensky said cruise ballistic and aeroballistic missiles, Zircon, Iskander, Kinzhal, in total about 120 missiles and 90 drones. Our air defences destroyed more than 140 air targets. They said that F-16 jets were used to repel this attack, shooting down munitions in the air. We don't know if they were missiles or drones or what have you. I think I've seen a report somewhere saying that reflects about an 85% knockdown rate by Ukraine, which obviously is good, but clearly means that something does get through. And when you're talking these kind of numbers and those kind of capabilities of ballistic missiles, any that get through can have a devastating impact on the ground. So in response to this, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, he waded in and talking in the context of Olaf Schultz's phone call. This is on Sunday. Donald Tusk said, "The attack last night, one of the largest in this war, has proven that telephone diplomacy cannot replace real support for Ukraine from the entire West. The coming weeks will be decisive not only for the war itself, but for our future." Sumy, the city of Sumy, was hit by a ballistic missile about 9:30 p.m. Saturday evening, local time, killed 11, injured 89. Moldova's foreign minister waded in, said that huge drone attack overnight Saturday, Sunday had violated Moldovan airspace. Miha Popsoy said, "We strongly condemn the violation of Moldova's airspace by Russia's missiles and drones targeting Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Explosions near our border and sightings of low-flying drones over villages underscore the risks to our people from Russia's brutal war." And just to bring us up to date, this morning, Monday, a ballistic missile attack against Odessa has killed, last count, killed 8, injured 18. So a very big weekend of airstrikes, continuing the theme, as I say, of late, but just the scale was bigger. Just one last one for me on the battlefield updates. As I say, on the ground, very, very little. A bit of movement south of Pokrovsk in the area of Khodorkovy, just coming north of the reservoir there, the Vovcha reservoir, but very little movement on the ground. It was mainly in the air where the war was prosecuted over the weekend and in the diplomacy. Just finally for me, though, Russian channels, mainly Telegram channels, are currently reporting that a large-scale leadership purge is underway in Russia's 3rd Guards Combined Arms Army. Now, there are reports that the command staff, so the headshed of the 3rd Combined Arms Army, has been fired, and the commanders of the 7th and 123rd Brigades have been arrested. Commanders were reportedly held and removed from their post due to, quote, deceiving senior commanders in terms of taking lines that are in fact still under enemy control. We've said this a number of times. They don't report bad news. They say they're in positions. They're not. They say that they inflicted many more casualties than they have. Maybe this is a reflection that you can go too far, even in the Russian army. I doubt it, though. Now, the 3rd Combined Arms Army has been primarily engaged in the Donetsk region and southern Luhansk Oblast. Now then, Francis, along with audio producer Adelie and videographer Jack, are currently en route to Ukraine. However, Francis couldn't turn up the opportunity to talk about the weekend's events.
Well, thanks, Tom. Dzień dobry from Poland, or should I say Привіт, as we'll soon be crossing the border into Ukraine. This is now shaping up to be one of the most pivotal weeks in the entire war, with the decision by President Biden to finally give the green light for Ukraine to use long-range missiles supplied by the US to strike Russia. The clearest indicator we've seen for a long time that the West is upping the ante in an attempt to put Ukraine into a stronger military and therefore political position, as the prospect of negotiations under a Trump presidency loom rather ominously on the horizon. But how significantly will this capability change things? Well, the first thing to underline is that, contrary to some reporting, the US missiles have been very limited in their usage to a very particular sector of the front, specifically where the Ukrainians cross the Russian border into Kursk. As we reported last week, an almighty battle is set to take place there as Moscow seeks to take back all of the remaining territory Ukraine holds onto, thus removing that bargaining chip from any future negotiation. In effect, Biden is telling Kyiv that Washington will support its efforts to hold on to that small chunk of Russian territory as a means for bargaining in the possibility of one day exchanging land for peace. But this is not the moment that the US unlocked the shackles, as it were, on weapons permissions. They remain limited and will likely have little bearing on the Donetsk front in the east. And yet, perhaps this marks the moment that it will persuade other powers to go further. And maybe we will see Washington also permit the use of storm shadows, as London and Paris have been urging in private for several days. So this may ultimately prove more significant politically than militarily, depending on what happens. Why now? Perhaps it's a gesture of goodwill from a departing president. But if I were to speculate, I would guess that the call which took place between German Chancellor Olaf Schultz and Putin over the past 48 hours was actually more coordinated with Western leaders in mind than maybe thought, i.e. it was a last attempt by them to appeal to the Russian president to de-escalate, otherwise the West would go further in its support for Kyiv. Putin's response, of course, were the worst attacks that Ukraine has seen for many months. And so the green light was ultimately given for Kyiv to be allowed to use these weapons on a specific part of Russian soil to damage Moscow's prospects of winning back Kursk. If that is true, and again I only speculate, then this was less a brave act than yet another example of Western powers reacting to Russian actions. I envy historians of the future if you're listening to this, as you will know what really took place over this critical 2-day period. As for me, the border beckons in this crucial week. You would have liked the look the Polish passport officer gave me when he asked where I was heading, and I said Ukraine. It was the raised eyebrow of a man thinking, is this the best London could send? Francis, over and out.
Now then, let's go back to the main story over the weekend, the Biden administration policy shift. So welcome, James, welcome, Joe. Interested in your views here. Nothing in Putin's actions over the last years, as far as I'm concerned, should have given policymakers any confidence that he will acknowledge or in any way make an allowance whatsoever for the geographically limited nature of this decision. He's not going to see only the Kursk Oblast bit. And as I said, we saw the usual performative outrage. We saw Russian lawmaker Vladimir Dazarov saying this is a big step towards the start of World War III. And then Dmitry Peskov weighed in this morning. He's the Kremlin spokesman. He said the decision would directly involve the US in the conflict because, in his quote, for what it's worth, the targets are set not by Ukrainian military but by specialists from these Western countries. That fundamentally changes the modality of their engagement. Now, if he's listening, I have a question for Mr. Peskov. Did the murder of British citizen Dawn Sturgis by Novichok nerve agent, quote unquote, fundamentally change the modality of your engagement? And Mr. Dazarov, inflicting or spreading nerve agent around the streets of Britain, is that a step towards World War III? No? Okay. Anyway, Joe, by allowing US weapons to be fired into Kursk region of Russia only, do you think Joe Biden has yet again signalled that he's looking at this war and the geopolitical manoeuvrings around Ukraine more broadly in a very, very different light to Vladimir Putin? Welcome back from the States, Joe. First time we chatted.
Hi, folks. Yeah, after sort of a 2-month stint in Washington, helping our election coverage out and trying to unpick the Ukraine story from the other side of the Atlantic, I've returned to Europe, which is nice. Not that I don't love our American cousins' food of burgers and French fries, but yeah, a hearty European dish doesn't go amiss. It's interesting, and I think the Kursk thing of it being geo-locked to this one region is very important in the decision, and it is basically what we can call a direct response to the deployment of North Korean troops in that region. It's as much as a signal to Russia as it is to North Korea to stop doing this. In terms of other triggers for this decision, I'm currently in the middle of writing an analysis piece, which will go up online in print tomorrow, about why Joe Biden's done this. He sat down last Wednesday with Donald Trump, and they described having this sort of civilized meeting about their transition. And in that meeting, we know they spoke about issues like the Middle East, other sort of domestic issues, but Ukraine was also one of those issues. And in this meeting, Joe Biden told Donald Trump helping Ukraine defend itself was in America's national interest. Essentially, he said it would be cheaper to fund Ukraine and its defense than for America to become involved in a wider European land war, which is the sort of assumption that if Putin is allowed to win in Ukraine, he won't stop at Ukrainian borders. And past Ukraine's borders are members of NATO. They are protected by Article 5, which we know would mean that the United States would have to come to their aid if they're attacked. That's a few reasons why we look at this decision from an American standpoint. And Joe Biden's very careful. He's a guy that's, maybe not him personally, but his team definitely are worried about escalation. Every move they make is calculated on preventing escalation. And that doesn't ever take into account the words that you were speaking about, Dom, about starting World War III from Russian lawmakers loyal to Putin. I remember, I think in September when the Storm Shadow issue first came up of Britain pushing to get Storm Shadows allowed to be struck into Russia, I wrote a piece basically headlined, "Every time Vladimir Putin has threatened World War III against NATO." As far as I'm aware, we don't have World War III yet. So that's basically the premise of it. Joe Biden, careful, very strategically placed in, yes, he doesn't want a further escalation. He knows there's actually very little you can hit in Kursk with ATACMS. It'll mainly probably be the job of the shorter range, which I think are about 110 kilometers, with the cluster warheads used to target gatherings of troops. You have air defense systems can be taken out by the unitary warhead ATACMS, which I believe are in very, very short supply anyway. So yeah, not a lot to hit. We still have no news on the Storm Shadow. And by all accounts, I'm not 100% convinced the Americans are going to give instant sign-off on that being used. We know roughly that part of the guidance system, the piece of kit that helps the Storm Shadow land where it's meant to land, is done by the Americans. I believe it could range from an actual part of the weapon, microchip or something like that, or even just the data that is provided to make the weapon effective comes from America. And they hold an essential veto over that weapon being effective. And the French today have come out and said, look, there's no decision on our part. So yeah, interesting stuff there that sort of suggests that maybe Joe Biden isn't quite ready to let rip with Storm Shadow and Scalp inside Russia. Maybe another decision on that is he could deem that too escalatory. It's a very different weapon. It's bunker-busting warhead. It's better against hardened targets than an ATACMS will ever be. And it's got a slightly longer range by all accounts as well. So decisions to be taken still going forward. I wouldn't get our hopes up on that to start with.
Yeah, interesting, Joan. I should have made clear when we started talking about this, folks, when we talk about ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, there are basically two variants of it. As Joe says, there's the warhead that has cluster munitions, which are designed specifically for attacking sort of soft-skinned vehicles and personnel out in the open, and that will include jets and helicopters and things like that. It's the sort of thing you'd spread across an airfield or spread across a piece of the ground where there's headquarters or logistic nodes or less protected pieces of equipment. And then you have what's called the unitary warhead version, which is just a massive, great big bang. Stop me if I'm getting too technical at the back. So we don't know what variants, or maybe even both, that have been allowed here. As you say, Joe, there's little to hit in Kursk. Yes, there are in Kursk Oblast. There are some fixed sites, but Russia would be daft to have not anticipated this and shifted things out the way. We think that they've been using airfields further back, out of range of ATACMS if such permission was given, and hence that their sortie profile has had to go up. The number of sorties they're flying because they are launching from further inside. The jets are launching further inside Russia, and they're having to release their glide bombs further inside Russia. So they're using them more often. We've seen that, but all of it suggests that they have pulled back a bit, knowing that the immediate border areas could well become vulnerable at a point in the future, which it now seems to be. All of which makes me question the politics of this, because, I mean, Joe Biden, even if you say, yeah, great, finally, we've got permissions, the argument hasn't moved on at all, and it's properly into the you can't be a little bit pregnant, Joe. As not you, Joe, not Joe Barnes, Joe Biden. Well, actually, I don't think either of you can be pregnant. Sorry, that's another podcast. Anyway, I digress. But you can't be a little bit pregnant here. We've been bashing you over the head, Mr. President, for months now about these policy permissions, saying, "Come on, what's the issue? What's the rationale? Talk to me about this escalation ladder thing, the provocation about Putin, etc., etc." And that is still there, because with the wording as it is at the moment, that these things can be used inside Kursk Oblast only because of the North Koreans and so on and so forth. We go, okay, yeah, great. Well, what about Bryansk Oblast? What about further away? What about Belgorod? What about somewhere else? Why limit it to Kursk? It's the same argument. So they don't win any points or they win a couple of points for actually giving these policy permissions. But they're still knee-deep in this, well, explain your rationale. Why not further? And that makes me wonder if this has been not very well thought through. It's a bit of a gimme at the end of a fairly tired administration. And I wonder if it's designed to set a very early tripwire for Donald Trump, i.e. is Joe Biden playing politics here, and he hasn't given this great geostrategic thought, hasn't taken advice far and wide from foreign policy experts and so on and so forth. He's looking at it through the politics lens. And what I mean by that, Joe, and please, I'm interested in your view here. What it does now is it gives Donald Trump, he's faced with three choices when he comes in. Either, and I say when he comes in, but of course he'll be asked about this from today if anybody has a chance. Does he A, maintain this policy? Does he B, expand it? Or does he C, rescind it? Which will he go for? Every one of them. I mean, okay, the guessing game is largely irrelevant about what Donald Trump's going to do because, who knows? But I'm still interested in your view here, Joe. But, okay, maybe a better question is whether this policy shift is born of serious strategizing, as I said, or just politicking to put Donald Trump in an awkward position. Where would you fall on that ledger, Joe?
It's a really interesting one. And I mentioned at the top of my sort of introduction that Biden and Trump had this meeting. But let's actually rewind to the day that Joe Biden took the decision not to run for president and handed the Democratic nomination to Kamala Harris. He apparently assembled his sort of closest White House aides after that decision and said, look, we have to Trump-proof our legacy and basically stop Donald Trump from undoing everything we do within the first days of his presidency if he's to win. And Ukraine and preventing Ukraine from falling in those days and weeks, as it was predicted at the time, and then helping Ukraine carry on its fight, is one of Joe Biden's legacies. And it is one of his biggest successes as president. He's had a pretty bad domestic time of it. But by helping corral Europe, corral the West to defend Ukraine has been one of his strong points. It's a strong point that Donald Trump, if he so wishes, could undo within 30 seconds of stepping into the White House. That is why we've seen decisions like the aid to Ukraine being sped up. They're trying to rush out everything that Congress has agreed to Ukraine and get it out there as soon as possible. But then one thing that could have happened is, in this meeting they had in the Oval Office in front of this sort of fireplace that was roaring, you had this warning from Biden saying, look, you have to carry on defending Ukraine. It's in your interests. He might have got a feeling from Donald Trump's reaction that Donald Trump isn't serious about defending Ukraine. And this is complete speculation on my part, this joining the dots, bit of blue sky helicopter thinking. So he's potentially got this feeling from Donald Trump that Donald Trump's not going to defend Ukraine, or he's potentially got from Donald Trump a sort of a timeline, a vague plan of how he wants to end the war with negotiations. And this going back to the very start of the war, whether it be Boris Johnson, Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden said it publicly in March, so days after the war had started at the back end of February 22, that everything the West was doing was to strengthen Ukraine when it comes to the negotiating table, strengthening Ukraine's hand for eventual negotiations to end the war. Does Joe Biden see this part of the plan as being key to strengthening President Zelensky's hand at the negotiating table? Is allowing strikes into Kursk going to help Ukraine keeping hold of that pocket of land that is going to be what Kyiv believes to be a key part of the negotiations, if there are to be any? And I think that could just be why that Joe Biden has also moved. He's got the North Korean aspect, so response to escalation, but then he has seen something or heard something from Donald Trump that makes him think we need to give Ukraine a little bit more at the negotiating table to help cement our legacy, what we've done in the White House to defend Ukraine. We can't let that all be undone by Donald Trump. So he is potentially deciding and responding to that element of their conversation, which I think is interesting. I'm digging deeper into it. The US has only just woken up. So hopefully by tomorrow, when I've got this piece out, or say later today, I've got this piece out, we'll know more of the answers to that. But I just think it's an interesting sort of area to reflect on. And I'll stop.
It sure is interesting. I mean, I can't imagine that Joe Biden wouldn't have told Donald Trump that this was coming down the tracks when they met last week as the start of the transition. I mean, my God, that would be so irresponsible from one president, regardless of politics and the campaign and all that kind of jazz. But it's so irresponsible not to have let him know this. So, you would hope, you would expect that Trump and his team would have been thinking about this, even with all those photos of them on whatever that private jet was, covered in Big Macs and God knows what else. In between the filet of fish, you would have thought they'd say, okay, well, what does this mean and where does it go? So they would, I imagine, hopefully have a view by now. If somebody buttonholes them and says, what's your view, Mr. President-elect? Are you going to continue the policy, expand it or rescind it? Who knows? But I mean, Donald Trump has been bigging up the old Republican strategy of peace through strength. And surely rescinding this goes against peace through strength in whatever future negotiations might be coming down the tracks. And also, last point here before I go to James for your thoughts, James. I've mentioned before about Trump 2 is going to be different from Trump 1 in the circumstance, i.e. before there was not such a clear route between the link China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whereas now it's in your face, it's very much there. And a phrase that I heard this morning on Radio 4 Today programme from Amal Rajan, so I can't claim it, but he's calling them the crinks, the crinklies. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, crinks. You might hear this term. It's gonna catch, isn't it? You'll hear it. So the crinks. Donald Trump could be the guy to break the crinks. If someone says to him, look, you can save the universe, you could be Superman here. You've been very, very open in your condemnation of Iran, been a bit lukewarm elsewhere. You tried to make pals with North Korea and they threw it back in your face and then you ignored them. Well, you can't ignore them now because they are so wedded into this grouping, the crinkies. So what are you going to do? And I don't think you can take them piecemeal now in terms of geopolitical foreign policy issues because they are so totally wedded one to another. And I wonder if his response to this about the policy permissions will show a bit of leg, show a bit of ankle. Was it lift the kimono, our US cousins say, to give us a little bit of an insight into how he might approach that much broader question and arguably longer term, although it's coming down the tracks quickly, about what to do with the crinks. Let's go back now, if I may, back into Europe. Let's dial right down, zoom into Berlin. James Crisp, Olaf Schultz picked the phone up to Vladimir Putin on Friday. Doesn't seem to have done an awful lot. And then in a response, well, maybe not a response directly to that phone call, but there was a massive aerial attack over the weekend. So has Schultz been humiliated by Putin? How has that played out in Germany? Has Schultz burned or burnished his election chances? And do you think this decision from the US on ATACMS has in any way shifted the dial on Taurus?
I mean, look, why has Schultz done this? Why did he pick up the phone to Putin now? I think it's quite clear the reason has very little to do with the actual war in Ukraine and far more to do with the sort of political civil war which brought down his warring coalition. Now, regular listeners are probably aware that the government collapsed. It's been dysfunctional for quite some time. Part of that is because of Olaf Schultz. Part of it is because of a pro-business FDP, quite hawkish on Ukraine, and the Greens, which are also hawkish on Ukraine, more hawkish than Schultz himself. Now, look, how does this go down in German public opinion? I think it's fair to say Germany is quite schizophrenic on this, right? They know that Putin is a wrong-un, but there's also a belief deep in the sort of German soul that talking is good. Now, talking might be good. That sort of fits into the kind of political culture there in Germany. And it's also fair to say that Olaf Scholz, centre-left SPD, is historically more Russia-friendly. But at the same time, there's a recognition that the era of cheap Russian gas fueling the economy is over. Let me illustrate the schizophrenia at the heart of German politics, yeah? Olaf Schultz has made this phone call to show that he is a statesman and he is talking to Putin and is a fighter for peace. Okay, that he would not do that if that was not popular with elements of his base. Yet, the most popular politician in Germany at the moment is Boris Pistorius, a defense minister who is a hawk on Ukraine. And there's even been talk of Schultz doing a Biden and stepping down as candidate in favor of Pistorius. I don't think that will actually happen. But the fact we're talking about it shows how split the SPD is and SPD voters are. Then you've got the center-right, which again, hawkish on Ukraine, led by Merz. But within the sort of right wing of German politics, you have the AfD, which is anything but hawkish on Ukraine and is basically a pro-Putin supplicant party. And then again on the left, you have a new sort of populist left party, which again is sort of a Putin-appeasing party. So there is a lot of divides here. Has it burnished his election chances? Well, they're slim anyway, I'd suggest at the moment. He's trailing behind the CDU. I think one thing we would say is, I don't know, I think that he's a dead duck, basically, if I have to call it. Has it burnished his election? Maybe it shored up elements of his base. Either way, he's trying to look like a statesman, but that's backfired because he hasn't spoken to Putin for 2 years. So I don't know if the electorate will be convinced by this new sort of image that he's sending out. And he's trying to be the big statesman on the international stage, but he's getting criticized by people like Donald Tusk, by the Canadians as well, I think, ahead of this G7. So I think not for the first time, he's vacillating and maybe failing to please anyone.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, his days were numbered ever since I mangled his name about a year ago and called him Gerhard Schroeder.
Well, in fact, you mentioned Gerhard Schroeder, one of the SPD's most long-serving chancellors. And now he's in the pocket of sort of Gazprom, the man known as the Lord of the Rings because he's had so many expensive divorces. I mean, Gerhard Schroeder is, again, that shows how deep culturally and how high up the links to Russia went. I mean, I was speaking to one of our colleagues based in Berlin earlier this week, and he said there is a real belief that you could change Russia through trade. That's why you had things like this Nord Stream pipeline. And look, we talk about why is Schultz vacillating on whether or not to give long-range weapons. Why aren't they as hawkish as us Brits? Well, let's be scrupulously fair here. There is a fear of escalation in Germany, and that fear becomes more acute the closer to Russia you are. And Germany is significantly closer to Russia geographically than Britain. And Germany has historically, in just about living memory, been invaded by the Soviet Union during World War II. And anyone who knows their history knows how traumatic that was for the city of Berlin. It's just a historical fact that the Red Army, when they invaded, were just as brutal as the Nazis had been when they invaded Russia. So there are reasons why in German politics, not wanting to poke the Russian bear too much carries more weight than it might do in Britain. I mean, look, I think what's interesting is what does Biden saying yes to the long-range weapons mean in terms of the German position on Taurus, if we're going to sort of anglicize it? Well, this morning, Olaf Schultz says, his spokesman says, clearly made his position on the issue. He will no longer change his position. Now, it's not the first time we've heard Olaf Schultz say that before executing a U-turn. I mean, he waited for Biden's okay before sending Abrams tanks before he agreed to send the Leopards. But I think the fact is we're in a campaign now, an election campaign in Germany. Ukraine as an issue is diminished in importance when you compare it to what is the EU's richest country. Its economy is beginning to have problems, partly because of the cost of living, driven by the war in Ukraine, you could argue, partly certainly by the loss of cheap Russian gas to Germany's manufacturing, definitely driven by the war in Ukraine. And that Russian gas, I think, is gone forever. So the German economy is hitting the roughest patch that we've seen a prolonged period of time. And when I spoke earlier about the schizophrenia, if you look at what the Greens have been saying, The Greens have said, yes, we will send tourists. These were coalition partners up until a couple of weeks ago or last week. The FDP, again, part of the now collapsed government, they said they'd send tourists. And the CDU, the main rivals, have said they would send tourists if they're elected. So where does that leave Schultz? Does he say, yes, I'll send tourists? Or does he try and hoover up the votes of those people who are nervous about sending long-range weapons by saying, no, I absolutely won't?
Yeah, all fair points, James, all fair points. But again, speaking of looking at these issues through the lens of domestic politics, which, OK, I'm not that naive. I know has to happen. Politicians do that. But equally, isn't that part of the reason why we're where we are 2.5 years into this full-scale invasion? There's been too much domestic focus and not enough kind of being able to get beyond that somehow. I do slightly take issue with your suggestion that the closer geographically countries are to Russia, the more fearful they are of escalation and perhaps a bit more reticent than some of us Brits and so on and so forth. I don't think that's necessarily the case for some of the Baltic and Scandi countries and Poland, some of the things they're mentioning. I mean, we've talked about Donald Tusk, or we've mentioned a couple of his quotes here today already. I had lunch with an ambassador on Friday, don't you know, particularly fine mushroom tart. That was what we ate, that's not him. And I won't say where he came from, but a Scandi Balt neighbourhood, and he was absolutely unequivocal. There was no fear of escalation there. If we hadn't been enjoying a particularly fine red Pinot Noir, I think he would have put his glass down and gone out and put his boxing gloves on. So he was very clear in the threat along the east there. But I think it's amazing that the Greens have come out.
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, you've got to say, out of all of the countries in Europe which have a complicated historical issues with wars, I think Germany's going to be right up there. It's quite a unique sort of position given, but basically because of the First World War and to a much larger extent because of Nazi Germany. So with Germany, when it comes to conflict, psychologically, it's complicated, to misquote the Facebook relationship status.
Yeah, okay, again, fair point, but I'm a little bit in the dry your eyes princess territory here. Germany, conflict, psychologically difficult. Yeah, it's difficult for all of us. None of us want to do it. And I think I can't find any countries, Switzerland maybe, who haven't a really visceral hatred or recent history of warfare. So yeah, no, I accept that to a certain point, but equally, I think you could put that on its head and say, actually, Germany, with your experience, and certainly this generation of leaders now, as they grew up in post-war Germany and what they learned and how they've absorbed the lessons and the knowledge of what happened in the Second World War, you could argue that they would be clearer-eyed about making sure that the scourge of humanity was never allowed to rise again. I don't think we're going to settle it here, James. I suggest we repair to the Duke of York like last time and carry this on. But just before you go, the talk of negotiations, obviously, which brings into discussion the Minsk 1 and 2 settlements in the end of 2014, start of 2015 that are seen as very widely discredited. But Germany and France played major roles there, possibly because of energy for Germany and what have you. But Germany and France now are very, very much more politically weakened now than they were. So even if I'm not suggesting there'll be another new Normandy format with Germany and France in the fore, but I mean, how much of a role do you think these two countries that you would look to be powerhouses, geostrategic powerhouses in Europe and NATO, how weakened are they going into any sort of potential negotiations?
Yeah, I think they are weakened, but I think any of Europe's leaders, including the UK, are weakened in the current climate. I don't think that Donald Trump takes European leaders particularly seriously. I think his incoming government would see, in terms of their geopolitical chess game, Europe as at best irrelevant, really. We're talking about big beasts. We're talking about Russia, China, the US. They've got more of an eye on Asia anyway. I think it's fair to say that a lot of Europe's leaders fear a deal being done between the US and Russia on Ukraine, which would basically set out the security architecture for Europe for decades to come, essentially without Europe being at the table. And I think that's held across the spectrum, right? Emmanuel Macron and Viktor Orban have both said that recently in recent weeks. If this affects Europe, Europe's got to be involved. But there ain't a lot of room at the table when you have these big beasts sitting there, and you run the risk of ending up on the menu yourself. You fell out with Macron during their first term, Trump did. Schultz is weak, and I'd say he's on the way out. And either way, I can't imagine Olaf Schultz and Donald Trump getting on. Look, Keir Starmer, Donald Trump. Again, I can't see him swinging Trump's decision-making process. So who can, right? So Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, part of the reason he's got the job is he has this reputation as a Trump whisperer. He's already been at pains to stress that the reason European countries have increased their defense spending is because of Trump's visionary leadership last time round. But he's got away with talking straight to Trump when he was Dutch Prime Minister during the first term. He's a very clever politician. I think he's one of Europe's cleverest. You don't get to be the longest serving prime minister of any country, let alone a country with as fragmented a political landscape as the Netherlands, without being a big brain. But who am I going to talk to if I'm Donald Trump? I might talk to Polish President Andrzej Duda. I'm not going to like Donald Tusk, because Donald Tusk has been mean to me, but Andrzej Duda is from a different party. He's from the Law and Justice. In my first term, he invited me to Warsaw. I gave a speech. They bussed people in. They all clapped me. It was fantastic. It was huge. It was the best rally ever. So I like Duda. As president, he can do stuff. He is my direct, protocol-wise, my direct sort of contemporary. So Duda can speak to Trump as a mate. Duda is part of the same sort of pan-EU political family as Giorgia Meloni, the leader of Italy. Now, I don't know for certain, but I would say that Meloni is up Trump's street. She's an attractive woman. That helps. She is a hard right leader who has done a crackdown on migration. That helps as well. She is pro-Ukraine, which helps Europe. She has a track record now of acting as a kind of bridge between your more sort of hardcore Eurosceptics like Viktor Orban, your hardcore nationalists, and establishment pro-EU conservatives like Ursula von der Leyen, for example, or even like Donald Tusk. She can talk to both sides there. And I think that she would try and become a bridge between the US and the EU as well. And we all know that she gets on very well and is close friends with Elon Musk, who is now part of Trump's government. And she's made that point herself, Meloni. So again, I think Meloni, incredibly intelligent and canny operator, and one who's got a good proven track record on Ukraine, where she does have a past admiration for Putin, but once she's come into power, and even before, she was straight down the line, this is not acceptable. After the invasion, she also unhooked Italy from Chinese Belt and Road Initiative money after coming to power. So I think that will go down well with Trump as well. So look, these people, these leaders might be able to try and chivvy Trump one way or another, but Europe is very much a junior partner. Look, with no Schultz, there's a chance for Britain, Starmer to try and step up and play more of a role, I'd say. We can get on with Macron, maybe do something there. But Macron, of course, he's basically limited to foreign policy now because he's saddled with a right-wing government he didn't really want. So I don't know. I think the tale of the coming years is going to be Europe trying to ensure that it isn't cut out of any final peace negotiation, and to make sure that it continues to support Ukraine. Ukraine is, after all, now a candidate country to join the EU, and European leaders, most of them have said they're going to continue their unwavering support regardless of what happens in Washington. Keir Starmer has said that as well. Let's hope that is how things pan out. I think there's a fear and a risk that when Trump really does get his foot behind the wheel, that we'll see a splintering of European unity, and by that, continental European unity on Ukraine. I think there'll be countries like Hungary which will run and try and get a pat on the head from Big Daddy Donald.
Well, thanks, James. Thanks so much for joining us today. And Joe's had to dash off, but Joe, thank you for joining us today. Well, what a difference a day makes, eh? 24 little hours. It's a big week this week because of the way it's started. Not only the massive airstrike over the weekend, but Schultz's phone call that then sort of briefly set the diplomatic wires abuzz before this apparent decision out of the White House has overtaken that. But it's all in the same context. What an incredible time to look at this war. We've got Donald Trump coming into power, it would be quite a good time to have a team reporting from the ground in Ukraine. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.